Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, I'm really excited to be speaking with psychologist Dr. James Hegarty. James, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Hi, Dan. It's great to be here.
Really excited to have you on. You're calling in all the way from New Zealand.
Yeah, that's right. Dunedin in the South Island of New Zealand.
And you've recently written a book, Act in Sport, and that's what we're going to talk about today. But I think to get us started, why don't you introduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience?
Well, I'm Jim Hegarty. I'm a clinical psychologist in Dunedin, New Zealand. I'm originally born in the States and grew up there and in Ireland, and did my training in psychology in New Zealand, and have always had an interest in sports psychology. But as is different from what I understand in Britain, it's there was no real training for sports psychologists when I did my training. So it's always been one of the things that I do rather than the main thing that I do, which I think that the situation is a bit different in England these days.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, there's so many more opportunities now to have a full-time position as a sports psychologist, and I think globally that's now changing. But I find it endlessly fascinating with somebody with, I suppose, mainstream qualifications and experience dives into the world of sport. I think that delivers quite a rich landscape of experience, Jim.
Oh, well, thanks. Well, there's quite a few people in New Zealand who've done that, who've been involved over the years and put a lot of effort into training and finding out more. So I think we're quite lucky in New Zealand in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've written this book. You've written it with a colleague of yours, Dr. Christoph Huelsmann, Act in Sport. And we're going to dive into Act. We have dedicated one episode around about a year and a half ago, to ACT, Acceptance Commitment Therapy, which is an approach that's becoming more popular now in sport. Where's this book come from, Jim? How long has it taken you to write? Whose idea was it? What was the process here?
Well, it's taken a surprisingly long time to write, I think, even though it shouldn't have. I don't know why. I looked at our deadline, and I think we were nearly 2 years over our projected time frame, which is really silly, I think. But because it shouldn't have taken that long. But the things got in the way along the lines. Because we're doing it part-time. It wasn't our main operation. But originally it was, three of us were interested in it. A friend of ours, Rachel Vaughan, and who's now moved back to Britain, and Christoph and I were interested in ACT and sport. And we thought, well, there's no real books on ACT and sport. There was one by I think Frank Gardner, but nothing that was really quite user friendly for both athletes and psychologists. We thought at the time, so that's what we decided to do. We do that, and a lot of sports psychs that we knew were interested in ACT, but there wasn't a lot of training available, and there wasn't a lot of resources available. So we thought, well, this would be a good, interesting project, and it's always interesting working with your friends. That was the plan, anyway.
How did that work out, working with your friends?
well, Rachel, unfortunately, had to pull out early on before we even started because she was moving back to Britain, and it was just too much going on. But it was an interesting process, really. I know on one of your earlier podcasts, you talked about there was someone, I can't remember the name of the person or the book, but it was about different personality styles based on animals.
Lawrence Allison, Professor Lawrence Allison.
Yeah, which I found really interesting, and I really wanted to buy. I'm going to buy the book, and that would have been useful to have starting out on this process. I think just the different, but it's all minor stuff. There was nothing. There was no, I don't think, major differences in about ACT. It was just about how do we present the book and how do we write it, that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I think whenever you team up with anybody, whether you're a sports competitor, participant, or whether you're a psychologist, even though you've absorbed yourself in the theory for many years, the reality is relationships in a working context can be challenging, can be fraught at times, because everybody's got different needs, wants, hopes, doubts, beliefs, expectations, values, haven't they? And so actually utilizing something like Professor Lawrence Allison's framework can be quite can be quite useful. I don't know if that episode came slightly late for you guys, but I agree, and it's a framework I'm now using in my
Oh,
work.
they're good. That's it. I'm not the only one who thought, well, this will be really useful.
No, not at all, not at all. Listen, I'm really keen to dive into this book because it really is a good book, and it's interesting that you mentioned that within ACT, hasn't necessarily been the literature out there that uh, both coaches and athletes can read, and that was something I was really struck by when I dived into the book. Was that there's so many exercises you mention it can be utilized as a workbook, again for both coaches and athletes, and I think that's a real strength of this book. It really is like a workbook. There's a great few chapters introducing ACT, but then there's so many little hints and tips and techniques that both coaches and players can use, and coaches can use with players. So I think it's going to be a great resource for both coaches and athletes. And it's a framework ACT, Jim, that I must put my hands up. I must be honest. It's a framework that I haven't necessarily utilized within my sports psychology practice. And there's definitely things within ACT, acceptance commitment therapy, that whether I do subconsciously or do in a slightly different way from perhaps the style in which the therapy promotes, I think I do certain things, but I historically have gone perhaps different therapeutic routes. But as I say, I think being a pragmatist, I think we have to use what works, and I can see how effective ACT can be. So let's get cracking. Can you take the audience through what ACT exactly is? I'm using this term. It stands for Acceptance Commitment Therapy. Take me through a little bit of an introduction to ACT.
Well, ACT is actually originally acceptance and commitment therapy, but now in terms of sports, and I know Steve Hayes, one of the developers of ACT, has been using ACT in professional sporting contexts, and he refers to it as acceptance and commitment training, really, which is slightly different, just changing the word, but it's to be shown that it's applicable to all of us, and that was originally the view of the developers, is that acceptance and commitment therapy isn't just about, and it's certainly not about, well, we're dealing with problems like psychopathology, anxiety, depression, things like that. That these are all, we're dealing with issues that are common to everyone. They're not things that make you deficient in some way or damaged. This is just the human condition. This is just the way things are. And that was a very, very striking part of ACT when I first came across it, is that it was dealing with issues that we all have.
Mm.
And I won't go into relational frame theory. It's a very complicated theory of how language works and basically how human thinking works.
Mm.
But that sort of underlies a large part of ACT.
With regard to that, I mean, I actually think, to be honest with you, I think that you, Christoph, and yourself really scaffold this nicely, and make it very simple for the reader. So, I think on the Sports Psych Show, we never try to get too deep and into the nuts and bolts of the underlying theories. But relational frame theory. What's the basics of that? That's simply saying that feelings and emotions drive behaviour more so than thoughts. Would I be right there?
Well, sort of the idea about acceptance commitment therapy and RFT, they call it relational frame theory, is well, can I explain a bit about RFT?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, try simply. RFT is well, it's an amazing. I stopped reading the literature. It's something like 70 papers that were supported it. And that was quite a few years ago. And they use it a lot, even with developmentally delayed children, dealing with prejudice, things like this. But basically, so it's has got a lot of support. It's not just a theory. But relational frame theory talks about the way language works, and language always has an emotional content, a
Mm.
very strong emotional content, even very simple things. So we react to our words, our internal monologue, as if that's real, especially for things that are important to us. And it creates an emotional reaction. But what we tend to forget is that that verbal language and those frames of relationship between things, that emotional content was all learned prior to about 16 months of age. People don't really have language. We've got words, but we don't make inferences about things that we haven't seen. For instance, we have to be taught. Now, I find this fascinating. We have to be taught the difference between here and there and between me and you. We don't have that idea. Those are frames of relationship which kick in humans at about 16 months of age, which no other animal, and they've looked for it,
Mhm.
no other animal can make those jumps of logic, which is quite interesting. But the really interesting thing is that because of these frames of relationship, if I tell you, I think it's the example we used in the book, if I tell you that snakes are dangerous and snakes live in the grass, then how do you feel about the grass when you walk into long grass?
I'm nervous about the grass.
Yeah, you're nervous about the grass, and if you live somewhere where there actually are snakes, then people can get quite scared. So we can be worried about things that haven't happened yet, and we can be worried about things that happened in the past, although they're not happening now. So, acceptance commitment theory, one part of it is learning how to have these emotions and these thoughts, but without feeding them, without keeping them going, without taking them too seriously. So we learn to diffuse from them and uh, not get rid of them. And that's what makes ACT different. Traditionally, in psychology, we would try and deal with difficult situations by controlling it. If we have negative thoughts, we need to get rid of them. We need to replace them with things that are more positive. Well, that works sometimes, but for the people who need that most, there's evidence in the literature that it actually makes things worse because you can't, if you try and stop thinking about something, what do?
Mm.
You just keep thinking about it. I often use the example with people of don't think of that pink elephant in the corner.
Mhm.
And sometimes I actually feel my eyes like wanting to go and look in the corner, even though I know there's nothing there. The harder you try not to think about something, the more often it pops up. So that's really sort of part of the underlying basis of ACT is that basically your mind has a mind of its own, and you need how to not get carried away with its habits of thinking and learning how to tolerate it, but not fight it, and not even tolerate it, but move your focus and your attention onto what's important. So, in the context of sports, that's what's happening right now. What's my job right now? What do I need to do? As opposed to what if, or think, what if something goes wrong, or all sorts of things.
Interesting. So what I'm hearing from you, ACT, acceptance commitment therapy, now potentially called acceptance commitment training, which I think probably in sporting context sounds a little bit more sporty, underpinned by relational frame theory, which in very simple terms links language stroke thoughts with emotion,
Hmm.
feelings. We link the two. And in many respects, the process of ACT, which we'll get into through its philosophies and tools and techniques and approaches, um, essentially delinks the two in many respects, and does so not by reframing language or thoughts necessarily, but through actually examining how you're feeling, examining your emotions. Would that be a neat summary?
It's a neat summary. I think I think the language is really important. I wouldn't use the
Hmm.
word examine personally because it gives the impression that you're
Okay.
intellectually examining. We'll always fall into that intellectual side. It's more of uh, say, well, can you give me if I have if I have a situation where I'm incredibly anxious, what I would do is I would suggest, well, I'd suggest to myself or to a client, I'd say, okay, where do you feel it in your body? You pay attention to the body sensation, you know, and then you move your attention back.
So it's paying attention. It's
Yeah,
paying attention rather than examining.
yeah, and you feel it. You basically just feel it, then move your attention back to what you need to do, you know.
Okay, gotcha. And that suggests flexibility. And you mention, to use another term here, you describe ACT as a psychological flexibility model.
Yeah, that's what the whole aim of the model is to create psychological flexibility. Is that you react more instead of just relying on old habits and emotional reactions. You can just respond to things as they're happening without any overlay of expectations or I'm thinking in terms of emotional things, not training. You can respond on the basis of your training, but not the basis of your habits of thinking and emotional reacting.
Okay, gotcha. And this is very much underpinned, the capacity to be flexible is underpinned by three pillars: openness, awareness, and engagement. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about these three pillars?
Yeah, openness refers to being really open to internal experience. A lot of the time, we try to ignore or block out unpleasant internal experiences, which causes a lot of resistance and takes up a lot of intellectual or cognitive bandwidth. In terms of ACT, the openness really consists of some sub processes called diffusion, which is, as we talked about, diffusing from your thoughts, sort of learning how not to take them so seriously. Is there just something in the background that's happening? The same way there might be traffic in the background outside. You don't pay attention to it most of the time. And the other sub process is acceptance, which is in ACT terms means not putting up with something, which is the impression that a lot of people have sometimes, but of actively engaging with your experience. In the original term of the word acceptance, it meant actively taking something. So if I'm reaching out and handing you an apple, for instance, you'll reach out and take it. So fully being willing to fully engage in your experience. And this is the bit of ACT, the acceptance bit that people really struggle with, that psychologists especially really struggle with, because it goes a bit counter to a lot of our training in trying to change things. Most of our training, I don't know about your training, but most of my training has been about how to change thoughts, change emotions, change states. Whereas acceptance is the opposite of that. And it really is a very different philosophical and practical shift, really. And the second pillar is awareness, and that's really being aware of what's happening in and around you. And these processes sort of overlap. So that's contact with the present moment, where we're fully aware of what's going on in our body and what we see around us. And what they refer to as self as context, which is the most difficult ACT process to understand. That's trying to think how to explain it. Self as context. It really is. Generally, if we're thinking about something and we think, oh, I'm really bad at this. I'm really bad at interviews. Okay, so I think that, then I'll go, okay, that's self as content. I will feel like I'm really bad. That's the whole world, right? So if you step back a bit and say, I'm having the thought that I'm really bad at this, whatever that is for you, then that self as process. You're sort of diffusing, as I talked about before, but you're seeing yourself as process. And self as context is really where you're not different from the context. You're just fully engaged in what you're doing. And I think that's something that is fairly common in sports. And one of the reasons I think people are drawn to sports personally is that when you're fully engaged in what you're doing, there's nothing else.
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I suppose what I'm thinking here in simple terms, it's looking at for instance, if you're thinking I'm really bad at, and I'm going to use a golf example here because I played pro golf. I'm really bad at that first tee shot because I'm so nervous. What you're asking me to do, that self as context, is to look from the outside in, essentially.
Uh, no, I think there's some of the early ACT books have put that spin on it, but
Yeah.
it's no. That's more looking at yourself from the outside in. Is more you're seeing yourself as part of the process. So you're just, this is what's going on.
Mm,
Self as context
yeah.
is more when you're fully engaged in the moment. Is what they might refer to as sort of like a flow state in terms of sports.
Okay.
You know, where you're just doing it basically.
So can you give me an example there of what that looks like?
Uh, well, I don't know what it's like in golf. I used to play football, and I still
Yep.
remember. I mean, it happens quite often to people. I think one time where I was never very good at defending, and I saw one of my friends was going down the wing, and I just did a perfect tackle. I mean, absolutely perfect. And it just, there's nothing. You're not even aware of it until after it happens.
Gotcha.
Those kind of experiences.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. A flow moment. Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that's how it would be in terms of sports.
Yeah.
We're not having those moments all the time, but that's sort of your aim is to move more towards you're just part of what's going on rather than you're separate from it.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
That would be my view of self as context.
Okay. All right. And then we've got engagement.
Engagement, that's basically just being fully engaged in your chosen activity, which means it's made up of two components. This is more in the bigger picture things, more values. Those are the things that are very meaningful for you in life. Like that, we tend to think of values in terms of, well, honesty and all that kind of thing. But now this can be, I like physical activity, I like running or something like that. It can be pretty vague. It's not goals. It's things that, for some reason, particular to you, they're just meaningful. You just like this. You know. So some things could be friendships. Some things could be sports. They could be family. They tend to be pretty standard for most people. And when we look at values, what we do is we then look at, well, this is the broad value. And then we move into, well, what makes up those values? What activities can feed those values? And committed action is simply just committing to doing value-related activity again and again and again, even though it falls down. Like training is a good example, where you have to commit again and again and again to go to training, even though you might not want to give 100% today. For the more casual athlete, it might be, well, it's raining, it's cold, it doesn't hurt if I miss this week, that kind of thing.
So if you're thinking negatively, if we can use that term,
Oh, yeah.
shifting onto your values can help you actually engage in the activity that you know that perhaps you should be doing, but you don't actually feel like doing.
Yeah. Instead of being driven by our emotions, and we say, well, this is actually important to me. I this is a part of my life that I value. So these activities feed that, and people generally feel better. I mean, it's one colleague of mine uses the example of picking up your kids from school. She said people she worked with would say, "Oh God, I'm late. I've got to go pick up my kids from school. It's such a hassle, that kind of thing." And he said, "Well, don't you like your kids? Don't you want to bring your kids home today?
Sometimes.
This is actually a really important thing. This is an important thing to do.
No, absolutely. So to sum up the underpinning pillars and processes, we've got three pillars: openness, awareness, and engagement. And within those pillars, 6 sub processes: acceptance, diffusion, values and committed action, self as context, contact with the present moment, mindfulness. So these pillars and processes act as a kind of a template for a psychologist or a sports psychologist to help an athlete, a participant in sport or any any domain, be able to manage their thoughts, their feelings, their emotions a little bit better, and subsequently manage their behaviors. Would that be a fair summary?
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. Any of the things, the barriers that get into the way of you living the life you want, basically, or performing the way you want to perform.
And interestingly, within this approach, and you mentioned it earlier, that it's not so much about reframing what you're thinking, reframing the emotion. It's about experiencing it closer, paying attention to it, which almost feels a bit. Again, I think you mentioned it, counterintuitive. It seems a bit strange, myself on the first tee, that I might want to engage in the emotion that I'm experiencing. I might want to pay attention to it. How does that actually help me? Because I'm kind of thinking, well, I walked to the first tee. I'm feeling really nervous. What you're saying to me is if I engage in it, it's going to help me. It's going to help me manage this emotion.
Yeah, and it's the thing that people do. It's exactly the thing people don't want to do. You don't want to pay attention to that nervous feeling.
Okay.
But being mindful of it is what it does is it helps you diffuse from that emotion. Paul Ekman is a famous. I don't know if you know the name. He's a famous
Yep. Yep.
researcher on emotions,
Mm.
and a lot of his work he's says that emotions have a very, very limited life. They're milliseconds. Generally, they're milliseconds. Sometimes they can last up to a minute. And when you say you have the thought that triggers, I'm always mess up the first tee. Obviously, there's going to be an emotional reaction, and there's a chain reaction of physiology that you can't stop. It's there, but it's very brief. What we normally do is we keep it going by saying, thinking about it, thinking what happened last time, thinking I need to get rid of this, or things are going to go really bad. Whatever it is that goes through our head, it keeps that emotion going. So technically, there's a secondary and a tertiary emotion. What we do by paying attention to it is we allow it to run its course. For that brief period, Paul calls it a refractory period, where that period where the emotion first comes up, or even secondary emotion comes up, there's nothing you can do. You can't think anything that isn't an anxious thought. You will have anxious thoughts. You can't stop them. But if you just let them run their course and don't feed them, that goes away, and then you can move your attention back to doing the things that you need to do. There'll still be like reverberations in the body. I think of it as like ripples in a pond, but you're not in the grip of that emotion as strongly. So basically, you're diffusing from the emotion. You're accepting it in diffusion and moving on.
So, and I'm just trying to use my own experiences here. I mean, I would be going into a golf event, and I suppose let to bring this alive for
Yeah.
the audience. I hear a lot in warm up, a footballer, a soccer player. They're warming up for a game and they're experiencing certain emotions or feelings, worry, doubt, anxiety, lethargy, fear. For me as a golfer, it was anxiety, it was doubt, it was worry. I would be standing there on the putting green 10 minutes away from teeing off, in events where there were very good players competing. I would be warming up putting, and I would be experiencing these emotions. So you're saying to me to be able to diffuse these emotions, so turn down the volume of these emotions or feelings. I should have paid attention to them, and become curious of them, keep paying attention to them.
Not necessarily keep paying attention to them, just being aware of them. It's that mindful approach, which is the way I view it is an open awareness, but you're not trying to keep it going. You're not trying to understand it. You're not trying to label it. And if you're preparing for putting, then you move your attention back to what you're doing. To practicing putting. It's very challenging, and people find it relatively it was, if I say it's challenging, it sounds challenging because we don't want to do it.
Yep.
But once you do it, it's surprisingly effective, and it can sometimes can be staggeringly effective. You know, not all the time, but I mean, but it does work. But so I've had clients I've seen uh, two, and they are unusual, who 2 sessions, you know, but they were desperate. They were really, really desperate, and I think that most people aren't that desperate. So they threw their all into this as a last ditch attempt to something to help.
Can you give me, obviously you won't name clients as we
Oh, yeah.
can't, but can you give me an example of what that give me a story here. What did that look like? What was the sport or the situation, even if it wasn't sport? What did they have to do? What did they do? And what was the difference?
Well, the people I'm thinking of weren't sport; they were
That's fine.
anxiety. They were anxiety. But the last sports person I dealt with over anxiety was pretty much the same thing. This is and I won't say the sport or necessarily the correct gender because New Zealand's quite a small country,
Of course.
but it was a person who was going to a training camp for selection for a national team, and the previous training camp they literally froze. I mean, literally froze and could not do anything with such anxiety, such performance anxiety.
I know the feeling. I know the feeling.
Yeah. Which meant they couldn't perform, had to be encouraged.
Yeah.
It was so. What we did was we basically went through the ACT procedures, and we went through some of the other exercises in the book, but basically mindfulness. Looked at values, because basically, why are you doing this? Something that's difficult. What are the values underlying this? So that gives us a reason to do this. And we looked at mindfulness, developed mindfulness of the body, awareness of body sensations. And we did basically, I think one of the exercises, we call it the walk-through exercise. Where we basically walked through the different situations where this anxiety gets really problematic, and would pull back a little bit. I think in the book we give an example of a golfer. I don't know if you saw that bit where you walk
Mhm.
through the situation. You don't. The idea isn't to walk through the entire scenario until you get it perfect. The idea is to expose yourself to those emotions over and over, as if you're in that situation. So then, when you do get in the situation, it's easier to handle it. Does that?
Uh, yeah, absolutely. And so coming back to this person who had frozen in their training camp. So you mentioned values, you mentioned mindfulness, uh, a walkthrough. So what I'm interpreting that as every single day, this person is visualizing, mentally rehearsing, going to the training camp, and as they're visualizing or rehearsing, they're thinking about going into the camp, doing what they're doing. They're experiencing the emotions as they're doing that. They're becoming mindful of their bodily experiences, their bodily sensations, and I suppose shifting their attention onto their values. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, in the sessions we would do
Mm,
for walkthrough would basically just be to repeatedly, maybe in a 5 or 10 minute session, repeatedly walk the person through a situation where the anxiety comes up. And if you get through a certain bit, like packing to leave for the training camp, for instance, or getting there, the first night, moving to the area where you're going to train, you know, the training ground,
mm.
then you do all these things, so you just get it. And then we would even sometimes imagine things going horribly wrong,
Mhm.
and experiencing the emotions there.
I love,
Basically exposure, really.
yeah, exposure therapy. I love the values side of things. That really resonates with me. What I understand about that, and it's something I do in my own work, is helping participants arrive at the values that they hold dear with relation to what they're participating in, why they're participating, and I suppose their everyday values in life, and uh, that gives them a platform to align themselves with those values when they're experiencing sensations or thoughts that could be deemed as unhelpful.
Mm.
Is that how values are used in the ACT process?
Yeah, well, values are generally used as as sort of like a guidepost. This is where I'm going, and like you say,
Mm,
when you have these unhelpful thoughts or and the emotions that go with them, it's if you refocus on the values, it's not so much to push through these unpleasant pieces, but they're like, well, this is why I'm committing to this, whatever the course of action is. This is why I'm committing to do this exposure therapy. This is why I'm committing to go for a run at 5:30 in the morning. Those kind of things.
yeah,
Does that sort of make sense?
yeah,
It's more of like
yeah.
this is the general, and it's interesting. A friend of mine, Tobias Lundgren, he's from Sweden. He's done quite a bit of research into values in sport,
Hmm.
and most of his papers, he's published a couple of things recently, but in English. Most of his papers were in Swedish, and he's a firm believer that if you live with your values outside of the sporting context, it actually improves your performance. And I believe he's got some data that supports this. Basically, the idea is you're not. I think you're not getting so burned out, and it can be little ways. You don't have to.
Yeah.
The great thing about values is we tend to think of the big things, but what feeds the values is important. So if friendships are values, then sending a text is fine. That's feeding the value. Because you can't engage if you're training for something. It's going to take you time away from your family. It's going to take time away from friends because you've got these other commitments. So any little
Mm.
way that you can find to support those values is good because it's allowing you to have a life just outside the narrow world of what you need to do for your sport.
Yeah, I can absolutely. That really resonates with me. I mean, I talk to participants about having higher purposes and values, so top and tail their behaviours essentially. But I like what you've said there, in as much as if friendship is a value, there's lots there's lots of ways in which that value can be executed, if you like. That's probably quite a crass term, but as you're saying, you might not be able to see your friends if you're away on tour for a couple of months, but you can send a text. And so subsequently that influences how you feel on a day-to-day basis, because you're actually engaging in your value. You're engaging in your value of friendship.
Yeah, I think I really like that term, executed. I think that's a really good. I hadn't heard it expressed like that before, but I think that's a good way of phrasing it.
Oh, well, I'm
Yeah,
pleased about that. I thought it sounded quite crass, but that's, if we're going to live our values, what are our values there
yeah.
for? Our values are there to drive our behaviours, aren't they? But they're there to help us manage our emotional states, I suppose, as
Yeah,
well.
because I think my experience is that if you do these little things, and often, I mean, I'm been guilty of it as much as anyone, where you don't contact a friend or you do things because, well, I haven't got anything to say, or, I haven't done it for a long time, so it has to be a big thing, But when you do those little uh, contacts, or those little values, or little things that feed the value, I feel good, you know. It just makes me feel a little bit better, a little bit more satisfied with life.
Yeah, absolutely. There's loads of techniques in the book, many sort of techniques related to the sub processes. Is there any that come to mind that you'd like to sort of talk about, or take us through it all?
Uh, Well, there's a lot I could talk about. I mean, when we wrote the book, what we wanted to do was make it user friendly. So we tried to put things in at the start where you could discover the areas you might need to work on for yourself and pick and choose. But a lot of the book is really it's what I would do if I was seeing someone. Some of the techniques and things that I would use. Did any of them stick out for you that you would want to look at?
Um, I've always been curious about utilizing ACT on a team basis, and particularly around values. I mean, can it be used to develop the values of a team? Is that useful when it comes to ACT?
Well, I think it definitely is. I think it's if you want to develop values of a team, I think ACT is a really good way to do it. The trouble is that you need to have the team's values, not values imposed on them from the outside. And the way we suggest doing that in the book, because we've got several values exercises of how to identify your values and then how to refine those and say, well, what does that mean in my life? What would that look like in a day-to-day or a week-to-week basis? So what we've suggested in the book is that basically you take people through an individual, everyone, and you can do it in a group. I've done values exercises in groups where you basically take everybody through an individual values exercise, so they've got a pretty good idea of what their values are, and then go into very small groups, maybe 3 people each, and just say, well, okay, what values do we have in common? And most people, the values are pretty similar, you know, family, friends, that kind of thing. You know, could be spirituality for some people, for other people it isn't. Creativity, learning new things. There's a sort of a relatively standard list. Basically, what you do is you get people to have a connection, a real emotional connection with their own values, then see the values of other people, and so they're connecting with similar values. Some of the values will be the same, and some of them will be different, but at least it gives them the opportunity to see their teammates and what's important to them. And then you get everybody together and you say, well, okay, what were the values that came out of this? And you list them all, and you get the team as a group to decide, well, how do they want to be as a team? What values do they want to live? You know, so, and generally the values are big, so it could be competitiveness, but then, okay, we got competitiveness and maybe loyalty or other things. Okay, what would this look like? What would this look like in a match? You know, what would this look like when things aren't going well? You know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and so those values can drive behaviours
On the
on
pitch.
the pitch.
Yeah.
If the players have jointly come up with those, co-created those, it gives them the opportunity to then go and, we use this word again,
Oh, yeah.
execute those values on the pitch under pressure, and help each other live those values or play those values, execute those values under pressure.
Yeah, and that I think because they've had the emotional connection to it, it's easier to do that, and it's easier to support each other because they're doing this jointly together and seeing each other as, well, these are people who have similar values to me, or values that are slightly different, but I can appreciate them. You know, I think it's really important. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, do you think when one does their own individual values, and or when a team gets together and they're doing their values, that values, I'm thinking of authentic values and inauthentic values here. But and I'm thinking in a sporting context. I'm thinking if I can have my personal values um, that might be authentic to me, but I'm also aware that
Yeah.
it might be, and I might be talking about the adult elite level here, the professional level, for instance, where we do have to go out and compete. And reality in professional sport is organisations are burdened by the notion of, ultimately we're here to win, right? And so, do you think that a useful conversation for coaches and players to have revolves around this notion of an inauthentic value, a value that doesn't necessarily feel authentic to me, but a value that maybe I feel I should have, like competitiveness, if that's not in my authentic value list? Or do you think it's a case of just having values, 3 to 5 values, let's say, that are authentic to me, but I have to seek every meaning out of each individual value that can help me on the pitch in any given situation?
Yeah, I think I think you need the authentic values and try to find ways of expressing those on the
Okay.
pitch. Inauthentic values just won't work, and that's why the psychologist has to be onto it and call people on it. You know, if you can, it's more difficult in a group rather than with individuals. But it's competitiveness, I'm not. Values are very interesting because it's often really difficult to say, well, is that a value or isn't it? Values generally are things that can't be achieved in act terms. So in that sense, competitiveness could be because you can always be more competitive. So I'm not really sure about competitive. So I never, if that's really a value. I would dig a little deeper and say, well, what's under that? Why would you want to be competitive, or what kind of people are competitive? To find out what's driving that
Achievement?
achievement. Yeah,
Could
yeah,
achievement be a
yeah,
value?
yeah. I think so. I think people will. So how can you show that on the pitch in a way that maybe fits with your other values?
Yeah. So I like what you're saying there, though, and I'm thinking this leading to great conversations with players and coaches is this notion of, if we have a word of value, let's use a more traditional one here: honesty. Um, Honesty can have multiple meanings, and so it's trying to seek out as many meanings as possible in as many situations as possible. What does honesty mean in all these given situations that we might encounter on a day-to-day basis within our environment?
Yeah. So in honesty, if you're giving an honest effort, you're honestly doing your best to get that tackle in, or or you make a mistake, you own up. You don't start blaming teammates, that kind of thing.
And so I can see a situation whereby if a coach knows a player's values, a coach can remind a player of his or her values, especially if there's, if that player is perhaps engulfed in emotion that's not helping. That can form the basis of a positive communication between coaches and players in that instance.
Yeah, rather than a more punitive one of pull your head in and get on with it type of thing.
Yes. Yeah.
A more supportive relationship or approach.
Well, because I think that's the challenge for coaches within those situations. The challenging situations is, what can we hang our hat on from a communication standpoint? What tools, techniques, philosophies do we have related to the human condition, essentially?
Yeah, well, I think the values are very much this very human, certainly, and I think they speak to the human condition because, as I said, I generally use a little list of, I think, 10. I mean, I let people add other ones in if they want, obviously, but just here's a standard to give you some ideas to sort of rate. How would you rate this? Is this more important than that? That type of thing.
Okay, so that's interesting. So you'd provide them with example values.
Well,
And
I get them to do exercises where there is no guidance, and then I give them some examples and say, well, okay, now rate which one of these, because I'm looking for the ones that are the strongest.
yes.
Really. So we work through a process.
And do you find that people, by and large, have very similar values?
Yeah, by and large they do. Yeah, it's. I mean, some people will come up with things like money, which isn't really a value. That's sort of a goal.
Okay.
Really, having lots of money is more of a goal than a value. Because, okay, why do you want money? Oh, so I can, sit home and play the guitar all day. So that's okay. So maybe music or creativity or learning a skill, developing skills, maybe those are values. But it's not the money. So you have to work through those kind of things.
You've mentioned this word goal. I mean, to finish off today, you've mentioned this word goal. Do goals and objectives come into ACT?
Well, they do in a way. I mean, I think in the book I was a bit heavy on anti-goals. I don't know if you got to that, but basically what we're talking about is ACT type things. I mean, goals. People generally know how to set goals. They can do that, and you can have values and have the goals that lead you towards your values. The idea is you can never get. It's like being a parent. You can always be a better parent, but you've got little goals along the way that might help you be a good parent this week and next year. But people get caught up in goals often, and I think this is often a problem for sports people, is you get caught up in the goal. The goal is to make a certain team, do a personal best, win a competition, and the goals become all encompassing. And if you don't reach the goal, you're a failure. You know, you feel really bad. But really, the goals are signposts along the way towards the values, and I think that's the way to look at them. I mean, obviously, in training programs and things, you need to have specific goals and things. I mean, we're not dealing with that area. We're dealing more the area of dealing with emotions, emotions and thinking. Yeah.
Gotcha. Interesting. Well, Jim, what I love about the book, as I said at the beginning, is there's so many. I mean, we weren't able and wouldn't be able to do it justice in a short podcast, but you outline clearly what ACT is, and there's so many little tools, techniques, philosophies, etc., which I think makes it very user friendly. It's very friendly for coaches and athletes to get a real grasp of what they're supposed to be doing. So it's a book that I think will be really, really useful, and one I'm certainly going to recommend. How can people get hold of the book? Is it through the usual channels?
Yeah, it's Amazon, Book Depository, places like that.
Yep.
Who else is there? There's another one, book something.
Booktopia.
Booktopia. Yep.
The usual online channels. Yeah. Well, fantastic. So do you use social media? How can people get hold of you if they want to learn more about ACT?
Well, I'm not a real big social media person, really. Basically, they can just write to me at James at hegartyconsulting.co.nz.
Perfect. Awesome.
Or probably find my website, Hegarty Consulting.
Perfect. I'm sure it's going to tap people's interest, and you'll certainly hear from people wanting to know more about ACT.
Well, that's really nice. I appreciate your comments. Because when you do write something like this, you don't know how it's going to be seen or received.
Yeah.
And I hope I managed to explain some things fairly coherently, so people, because ACT is quite, it's quite difficult to get your head around.
Yes.
I think. I'll just briefly tell you about when I first learned about ACT. I came across a book on ACT by a guy, the psychologist, who I'd read all these really interesting papers that he'd written, Steve Hayes. And it took me 5 months to read this book. I used to carry it around the house. I'd go into the kitchen to make tea, and I'd have it with me, and I'd be pondering it, because it did really challenge accepted ideas.
Yeah.
And I found it fascinating, but was having my difficulty getting my head around things like acceptance. I mean, really getting what is acceptance? How do you fully accept something? Going, opposite to my training, my CBT type training. So I suggest that if people are interested in it, to give it time, think about it, and if you can, go and get some training. Some group training is really good, because you get to see, well, for a start, you get to feel acceptance yourself. You get to feel what that's like, and you get to see it in other people. So when you're working with someone, then you can go, oh yeah, this person's not really accepting this. They're using little avoidance strategies. Yeah. So that kind of training is really useful.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Jim, thank you so much for your time today, mate. It was really interesting, and as you say, look, it's a complex topic. There's no doubt about that, and we can't avoid complex topics because I think within them lie some really, really important things. And I think ACT is a great framework. I think it's a great framework for psychologists. I think we have to continue to find the best way possible for coaches and maybe athletes to really be able to grasp it. And when they do, I think it can be a really useful approach for them. So thanks so much for your time today.
Oh, thank you, Dan. Thanks a lot. Appreciate you.
Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.